If you ask someone what love is, oftentimes they'll tell you a story. But the Apostle Paul doesn't do that. Instead, he describes love in these simple but profound ways. And people connect deeply with his words. We've heard this passage read at weddings, and we've heard pieces of it at memorials. But even though we've heard this passage used to talk about different kinds of love, about romantic love and about the love that we show throughout our lifetimes, the fact here is that Paul is referring to love within a Christian community. Or to be more exact, in his letter to the church in Corinth, Paul is concerned about the lack of love that he sees in this church. So what's the problem in Corinth this time? In this letter, we learn that the Christian community in Corinth that Paul has planted overflows with an abundance of spiritual gifts. This seems like a good problem to have. But in fact, this church has found a way to make spiritual gifts into some kind of spiritual status symbol. And the best of all the gifts, the pinnacle of status, is the gift of speaking in tongues. So those members of the community who can speak in tongues are more honored and respected than those who can't. And this gift is dividing the community so that they don't look like a community that loves and cares for one another. Thus, it is intentional that Paul starts out by saying, if I speak in the tongues of mortals and of angels, but do not have love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. Tongues of mortals is a reference to human speech, and tongues of angels again refers to this gift of speaking in tongues. In other words, without love, this gift that you all value so highly is nothing but an unpleasant distraction. And Paul goes on to elaborate that all these spiritual gifts that your community may have, whether that is the gift of prophecy or giving everything to the poor or committing yourself to martyrdom, all these acts that look like extraordinary spiritual gifts on the surface become meaningless without love. Now, I have never been a part of a Methodist church where people in the congregation spoke in tongues. But that is not to say that we don't have our own values around spiritual gifts. So the first question I want you to think about this week, either to reflect on for yourself or talk about with someone you're watching worship with this morning, is this. What spiritual gift do you think our church values most highly? What I notice is that Methodist congregations have an incredible history of service, that for the most part, we are a church of active doers. And there's no question that our commitment to service is a spiritual gift and a way that we connect to God and to love of our neighbors. But I have sometimes wondered if we believe that our churches only have value if we do a lot of things, if we're really, really busy with acts of service, or if our community calendars are packed with events and outreach. Because that is a big part of the culture that we live in. And as Americans, we all know that in our culture, being busy is a status symbol. Because if we're busy, that must mean that we're very important. And I have wondered if our church feels some of that too, that our church only has value if we are extremely busy. Of course, during a pandemic, our old ways of serving and doing aren't possible right now. And all of us, including your pastors, are wrestling with what it means to be a church that loves and serves our neighbors when we're not busy in the same way that we used to be. I want to turn back to Paul again and look at this scripture. So after he's informed the church in Corinth that their spiritual gifts are worthless without love, Next, he explains the concept of love to them in these beautiful words that we've heard so many times. I'm going to read them to you again, but I want you to be listening for how you hear Paul's words speak to us as a church in this current time. Love is patient. Love is kind. It isn't jealous, doesn't brag. It isn't arrogant. It isn't rude. It doesn't seek its own advantage. It isn't irritable. It doesn't keep a record of complaints. It isn't happy with injustice, but is happy with the truth. Love puts up with all things, trusts in all things, hopes in all things, endures all things. Even though the words are simple, there's so much wisdom packed into this description. Paul is giving us a full picture of love and all its qualities, including those that may be a bit of a stretch for us. For our second question today, I want you to think about the words you just heard and reflect for yourself or talk about this with your neighbor. In this time, when our churches aren't as busy and not serving in our usual ways, how do you hear Paul's words on love speaking to us? We have such an active, loving faith as Methodists, which is a great strength. And I see this in our congregations happening now. I see it in the way that people continue to call one another and check on their neighbors. I see it in our financial support of the food banks and the people that are out there making masks. And as I listened to Paul's words, I heard this other kind of love being talked about loud and clear. Love is patient. Love puts up with all things, trusts in all things, hopes for all things, endures all things. And for a church of mostly doers and people who are happiest getting together to serve others, I'm not sure I can think of a more challenging task than being patient and putting up with all things. Wouldn't it be easier and more fun to organize a community potluck? Or if we all could go down to the food bank together and do some good work? Oftentimes, our hardest spiritual work and the places we are invited to grow the most are not the areas we would choose. It is the work that presents itself and the things that come up in our lives that we just have to deal with, like COVID-19 and all the disruptions and the fear and the grief that has come along with it. Coping with this time is spiritual work for us. So if love means putting up with all things, that might include not knowing when we're going to gather, or exactly when we can get back to activities, or what that might look like. Love that endures all things as a community could mean weathering this hardship of not being able to gather and worship together. And at the same time, love that trusts in all things could mean continuing to trust that God is at work in us and through us, and sometimes even in spite of us, in the middle of a pandemic. And love that hopes for all things could mean that even though we aren't serving in the ways that we're used to, we fully expect that God is going to lead us in new ways to serve our neighbors. As Methodists, our default setting is to think of love primarily as an action, that love is what we do. And I know I have preached on this more than once, because that is a classic Methodist point to make. But it is also true that love creates these qualities in church life that we not only share in together, but are invited to grow into together. Can we be patient together and bear with one another in love through this time? Can we increase our capacity for hoping for all things together as a church, even when the future is unclear? I also hear Paul's words reassuring us today. Do not forget, dear church, filled with doers, that love never fails. It didn't fail in Corinth, and it's certainly not going to fail now. Anytime we are doing our best to love in our own human, imperfect ways, we know that it's not only our love that is at work. It is God's love that comes alongside ours. And as we work at practicing this kind of patient, enduring love, God's love promises to sustain us and guide us. Even in a pandemic, we are going to keep practicing love in our church through the grace of God. And we might even be invited to grow in our capacity to love as we do this work together in new ways. Amen.